Hi, welcome to Capstone, and we are excited to be talking about actually one of my favorite topics. That's really not a joke, but motivation seems to be at a low, and I don't blame anyone because this is kind of a weird way to, I don't know, just do this. So I am going to try to keep it peppy. Hopefully, again, try to give you knowledge you can use. And we are in chapter 16. This actually is the last chapter before we go on spring break. So kind of where things are at, if you do watch this, is I pushed your persuasion paper back to Wednesday. So that's due on Wednesday. And then this lecture and your reading quiz. And then you are free. You have spring break. You cannot go to Miami. You cannot go to Hawaii. No, I don't know what you're doing, but hopefully you have a good spring break. It seems weird because I feel like we've already been on spring break, but we'll have break. After we come back from break, just as a recap, we're going to do 2 more papers, and that's it. So keep your momentum up with me if you can. We're going to try to wind this up as fast as we can, and shh, don't tell, but we may even be done little bit early, just a little bit. Don't ever make that gesture in front of a man. Little bit. Okay. So here's my problem. Organizational communication is my field of study, and certainly the one I've published the most in. And I have all these PowerPoints up here because this is like everything. And I wrote the majority of this chapter in the Capstone book. So again, I'm going to use some mishmash of some older PowerPoints to kind of highlight a few things that I think are important. And again, because we're not sitting in class having discussion about these and current events issues, it does change how much time we spend on the material, especially since some of it is review. And I don't know how many of you took organizational. I know I have a lot of you for leadership or have had you for leadership. So I'm going to focus more on the organizational portion of the chapter. And one of the things that's important to me about organizations is the different paradigms that have evolved over the years. And I showed you a little bit of this in leadership, but we started, and again, you are not responsible for these whole PowerPoints, but they do go along with the chapter. We started in really classical approaches, and those classical approaches in a large way include scientific management, and Frederick Taylor was the big proponent of that. And I started to show you the world's greatest bastard. It's honestly, it's a video on YouTube. We'll take a look at it today. But Taylor comes to us at the turn of the century industrial revolution. And at this point, workers are seen literally as machines. And there's only one way to do any job, and there's a best way. And you need to do that very scientifically. So you should be compensated if you do your work well. This is all Taylor. Labor should be divided. And I have a picture here about where we are at the turn of the century. Most people are working in factories. You're getting incentives for every piece you can sew perfectly or scientifically. And certainly Taylor thought, forget about equality. Men were better qualified to do some jobs. Women were better qualified to do some jobs. So Taylor was a meanie, and he believed that the central problem was, again, theory X, management's inability to get compliance. You have to basically threaten those people, whip those people into shape. He was very authoritarian in his approach to early management, as any movie you've seen with factory workers, I think, has some of that in them, where it's always the boss standing over you 12 hours. There was none of this regulated hours and breaks and this kind of stuff. It just didn't exist when large organizations and factories were starting to become more and more prominent in our landscape. So management just needed a way to control the large amounts of workers in the factory. Along come unions, and they start fighting for people's rights, which they didn't have before. And I think, let's see what we got here, just for grins and giggles. I'll try not to take too long. This is Frederick Taylor, the biggest bastard ever.
Historiadores escribieron cosas muy curiosas en los medios.
In Spanish.
¿Sobre de quién es?
Ha ha! Whoops! Well, gotta love it when that happens. Maybe this one is not in Spanish. Yeah.
Back to the battle at Midvale Steel.
I hunted up some especially intelligent laborers who were competent men, and I deliberately taught these men how to run a lathe and how to work right and fast. And every solitary man, when I had taught them their trade, one after another turned right around and joined the rest of the fellows and refused to work one bit faster.
Taylor decided to take the next step. He said to the men,
"Now I'm going to cut your rate in two tomorrow, and you are going to work for half price from now on. But all you have to do is turn out a fair day's work, and you can work better wages."
Eventually, the men caved in, and production rose at the Midvale Steel factory.
After that, we were good friends, but it took 3 years of hard fighting to bring this about.
Emboldened by this success, Taylor became a highly sought-after.
You could certainly see where this is going. He basically kept threatening and threatening and threatening until he wasn't going to pay them if they didn't finally get their asses in gear and work for him. This is a type of management really nobody was happy with. It did, of course, the workers were working harder, but it did nothing to give them any morale or any kind of human resources. So there were some other scientific management theorists that came along, and we didn't really start caring about the workers themselves till much later on. So we have to switch because this entire PowerPoint is on scientific management, and we don't want to watch the whole thing. But that was the very first page. And again, it's talked about right at the beginning in it's actually chapter 17. I'm so sorry. I give you one paragraph about scientific management theories. We then moved on to the Hawthorne studies and the development of human resources at work. And this was a very critical time period for us when Western electric plants started doing a lot of testing to see, well, maybe we should pay attention to the employees. Maybe there's something about this that we need to take into consideration. So here's what happened. This is probably, if you graduate as a comm major and you don't know about the Hawthorne studies, yes, it would make me cry. Seriously. It's like the most fundamental study in the movement of human relations. So your book talks about it, and it talks about what happened, but I have a YouTube video for you.
The Roaring Twenties, an era of excitement like few others in American history. An era of uproar in, well, everything. A scandalous dance called the Charleston caught on, bringing hemlines up so they could swing to the new music. Ladies bobbed their hair and covered it with cloche hats. The noble experiment tried vainly to erase demon drink from America. Speakeasies, though, became as common as prohibition agents, and bootleggers were both the heroes and the villains of the age. Scarface Al Capone was a legendary example. Harding headlined the executive branch and Teapot Dome, but America kept cool with Coolidge. A young pilot named Charles Lindbergh flew non-stop across the Atlantic and shrank the world, earning its lasting adulation. The But perhaps the grandest star of the era was the automobile. Nothing in the 20s revolutionized the lifestyle of Americans more than the incredible motor car. Henry Ford's development...
Okay. So the motor car, blah, 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 blah.
Considered an extension of the machinery, the industrial man was often less important than his output.
Yes.
Working conditions were difficult.
Yes.
Supervision usually autocratic, and benefits non-existent for most workers. In sweatshops and even in better factories, it was production that mattered. At Western Electric's Hawthorne Works in Chicago in the 1920s, telephone equipment was being manufactured by 40,000 people. What Hawthorne employees had received their company-paid pension plan back in 1906. They had vacations 1 week after 5 years, and they had sickness disability pay. Hawthorne was considered a progressive place to work.
Mm-hmm.
Those who worked at Hawthorne were really respected in the neighborhood.
It was considered quite a privilege to be working here.
At this and 3 other companies in 1924, the National Academy of Science began an experiment to determine how illumination affects worker efficiency. The premise was that output would improve if the lighting of work areas was improved. Something very curious happened when new experimental lights were installed. Output went up among those employees being studied, and also among those whose lighting had not been changed. And most puzzling of all, it continued to go up even when lights were turned down. Having proved nothing, these studies were called off by the National Academy. It might all have ended there. Relay making was picked for a new experiment when Western Electric alone decided to probe the inconclusive results of the illumination studies. 6 young women assembled the electromagnetic switches while rest breaks and different hours were tried. It was the core of what would later be called the Hawthorne Studies, industry's first scientific inquiry into employee attitudes. Continuing changes in routine were freely discussed with the workers, whose output as well as involvement in the project increased dramatically. Each completed relay was counted by a tireless tape, which recorded an overall production increase of 30%. In this small room for more than 5 years, observers studied workers producing more in less time than ever before. Industrial history was in the making. The Hawthorne-Harvard Cooperative Inquiry continued into the 30s, delving into production areas all over the plant. When the early returns from the relay room began to be understood, the investigators felt the attitudes of other workers ought to be explored. They began industry's first formal employee interviewing program. Some 20,000 Hawthorne people aired their feelings about their jobs, their supervisors, their working conditions, about anything and everything. In other experiments, investigators found the first clues to the social organization of people at work, an organization that seemed to have as much or even more impact on output than anything management did. Though not all the results were as dramatic as the relay room, in general, output increased wherever these tests were tried. The investigators found industry had never tapped the workers' real worth and sent the massive proof back to Harvard for compilation.
Okay, I did want you to see a little bit of that because these studies really revolutionized organizations. You heard these were the first studies to actually ask people what they thought. How crazy is that? And certainly that's what many people thought, but they paid attention to the workers and said, we want to know how you feel. They decided to actually communicate with the workers. And again, this came out with some human relations movements impacts that if you pay attention to your workers and actually talk to them instead of just stand over them with a sledgehammer, they'll increase their productivity. So it changed fundamentally the way human relationships were viewed. Relationships between workers and supervisors became very important. It also, early on, they only saw downward communication. I tell you what to do, you do it, or I bust your ass. This really got managers and people looking at the informal communication that existed between employees and the idea that the employees could communicate upward to the management and offer solutions, revelations, and help. So again, I think they're fascinating. I love them. To me, this is the foundation of organizational communication at its core and the way we fundamentally changed our management studies and what we were doing. So that's the part about the human relations. We'll move on. We stay in that kind of human relations era, and a lot of companies are still in a human relations or human resources approach. One of the bigger ones that came out later on, though, was, of course, something you've probably heard about because it's talked a lot about in the communication paradigm and world. And this was a second shift. We're using, scientific management, human relations, human resources. These are all very prescriptive approaches. And all of a sudden, we thought, well, it's about how we affect the organization. But what if organizational culture and networks are the way we explain what's happening in the organization? So this is almost like a social construction of reality. It's not, I tell you what to do, you do this, I do that, and we have a reality. One of the most interesting, fascinating research projects I ever did was going in, I've told you about it probably, and asking people what the unspoken mission was of an organization. Because an organization can be prescriptive and say, here's who we are, and we're so happy. But what the people in the organization are actually doing and saying is much, much more indicative of the culture and what's actually happening in that organization. And that's where we make a shift over to the systems approach. Most of you are probably familiar with systems theory, and of course, it's talked about in great length in the book. It looks at more of a holistic process, that the whole organization is interacting with each other and affecting one another. So again, we're going back to, it was one of the axioms where we looked at how every action affects another action. And we are an organism that keeps evolving. So these words are kind of all defined as key words in the chapter, and that we have input, throughput, output, requisite variety, equifinality. There's a ton here. I think most of you know what these words mean, and they're obviously in the book. So let's get to, what do we do with all this? How does this apply to organizations? Well, we begin to look at organizations as either opened or closed. Some organizations have boundaries, tight boundaries. You cannot get into the system. There's not a lot of equifinality. I would say highly closed systems are going to die off. And one of the things I like researching in organizational theory is organizations that have died off. Or, Blockbuster Video is pretty much one of my favorite ones, because they were approached by two people with a revolutionary idea, and they said, no, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. And they turned down basically Netflix, and they went bankrupt, and Netflix is still here. What this kind of looks like for businesses and organizations is that we have to change within our environment. And if we don't change and keep some open boundaries and let the outside system affect the organization and vice versa, it could ruin our business. So I'm a big fan of systems theory, because look at what we're going through right now. Coronavirus is affecting every single thing. And every time I see a new business doing something, I'm just like, yes, good for them. Way to stay alive. Equifinality, requisite variety. They're practicing it. And my favorite I can't give away, because then you'll all go there too. No, I'm joking. It's Spitz's birthday today and our anniversary. And we're going to order out tonight, because that's like, woohoo, we're all excited about ordering out from a restaurant. But this particular restaurant is even now selling pasta, which is actually pretty hard to get your hands on. They make pasta, and they'll sell you the pasta so you can go home and boil it and make it up on your own. And now they're also selling their different sauces from the restaurant. And I was like, genius. What a way to keep your restaurant going and change. Find a different way to still keep bringing money in. And a lot of businesses are having to do this right now to figure out, okay, we can't have customers, so how are we going to stay operating and making money? And systems theory says you have to be able to evolve. And what happens if you can't evolve and adapt? You die out. I think this is such a critical perspective for organizations and communications, and it's one that I am very, very interested in how we go about opening and closing our boundaries, using information from the environment, etc., to make sure the system is operating at its full potential. One of the ones I also talk about is a system, W.L. Gore. If we were in class, we'd totally get into this. W.L. Gore makes Gore-Tex products. And I feel like I should jump up in my chair and get all my Gore-Tex out. But they have a flat organization. There is no hierarchy, no structure in their organization. Everyone has the same title. They're ingenious, really. They found different ways to go about things. So let me not get too caught up on this. We also have the organizational culture theory, which is fascinating. It views, again, organizations as cultures, and cultures too have certain rituals, certain ways they communicate, and if you don't learn those, that can be kind of difficult. I think this PowerPoint talks about cultures. I'll give you just a little bit here because I don't want this video to get too lengthy. In the 70s and 80s, they questioned popular rationale. It basically said organizations aren't rational. People are frequently absurd, self-defeated, disjointed, and irregular. Yes, raise your hand, that's me. So this notion of culture comes out of anthropology, but I think this is what it comes down to. Culture is something an organization has. It's also something that is shared. So rather than being one variable in an organization, culture is everyone's shared interpretation of realities. If I were to ask you, and I do this when I teach org, to describe the culture of SDSU, and this is hysterical because you all draw bottles of, oh crap, what is it? You draw bottles of, it's not Jameson, is it? You tell me. It's so funny. You do these huge collages with all these things about SDSU. You put Hepner Hall on there. You put the bell tower on there. You say fucking nothing about academics. So the reality you're telling me is really this is about our social growing time and not about studying. And I think it's just hysterical in a way because that's what's most prominent at the front of your college life. So again, culture is another way we can look at organizations, and we can even talk about culture through communication rituals, myths, legends, all of these. When I sit down and talk about my family has a culture. We have certain rituals, we have certain stories, symbols, even words that we've made up and used. And that would make coming into our home culture weird for anyone. So they talk a little bit about the cultural approach. The last approach they talk about, I think, kind of spins off of culture and systems theory, and it's the communicative constitution of organizations. I'll be honest, this is the one part I didn't write. This is not my favorite theory. I think it looks at pretty much, again, what we've already said we have to do to work effectively within a system and create a culture. But look at that, take a look at it. And then the second half of the chapter falls to just some kind of major concepts and some of the things organizations are concerned with. And again, I wrote most of this section of the chapter as well. So we're usually concerned with supervisor communication, and I actually have a publication on that and how we look at how we communicate. And certainly we communicate through a lot of different networks with a superior and subordinate. If you took me for leadership, you already know the better your relationship with your superior and subordinate, probably the more you're going to like working there, the more you're going to put out, the better it's going to be. The notion of what makes someone satisfied in a job. Definitely read this section because, again, it's not money. It comes down to relationships, empathy, nonverbal. I'll throw my leadership article up there. If you read it when you were in leadership, yay. But it's basically the argument of out in the workforce, what effect does superior subordinate communication have on job satisfaction? And what I found in the research is the communication between a superior and a subordinate in a workplace pretty much can predict almost 100% of job satisfaction. I think I predicted about 80%. So it's absolutely crucial, this communication and job satisfaction. Organizational socialization. or assimilation is talked about, very popular theory about how people go about assimilating into organizations and how newcomers feel. And you have to learn all kinds of things. There's can be a reality shock. You have to make sense out of how people are doing things. And a lot of times as a newcomer, you may either feel communication deprivation or communication overload. You also usually feel a, a type of uncertainty, many types of uncertainty when you enter into organizational life, and it affects the way you communicate and how much is communicated to you as a new person. So again, these are entire lectures, an entire course. So I'm probably already giving you too much information, and it's just because I enjoy really studying this type of organizational behavior. Organizational identification is in there, and then the last part was also not written by me, the motivation. It goes into expectancy balance, which is fine. I usually think of that more as a theory that applies in other areas, but certainly it could apply here. So at the end of the day, I guess I hope you know about the Hawthorne studies. They were critical to propelling communication in organizations between superiors and subordinates. That the communication between superior and subordinates is probably the highest predictor of job satisfaction. And I think we also have to look at organizations now as a system, as a created reality, as a culture, something that is ever evolving. So I think those would be the three big takeaways for me out of the org part of this chapter. All right, like I said, it's so hard to just talk to a screen because I feel like I'm just blabbing away and you're going, "Oh my God, is she ever gonna stop?" I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop right now. So we will talk more soon. Take your org quiz. I'll be back with leadership after the break. Whoops. I think I might. No. Oh shit. Whoops. No. Oh no. No, 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 no.